Let me first say, this joint work with Maya Adena, Ruben Enikolopov, and Maria Petrova. So this is irritating. Do you see this thing move the window away from the shared application?
Yes.
Okay, that's stupid. Let me just see what I can do about that. So I'm going to make this a full screen. And now start my share again. Sorry about that, but I don't think none of us wants to see that for an hour and a half. Okay, let's hope that this is going to do the trick. Okay, so what's this paper about? It's about the question, what can you do to change the morale of a population whose government you're actually waging war on? So if you're fighting a war, one of the things in which you can win is that the enemy's army or their people just throw away their weapons or overthrow their government. It's the most bloodless form of conflict. And as we know, conflict is a constant of human life. So, there's all sorts of armed conflict for the last few millennia. So this delightful option, this idea that you can just convince people either by shows of strength or propaganda and manipulated information to just give up instead of actually having to do the hard work of fighting is very seductive. And what we want to do in this paper is to think more about when and under what conditions this can actually work. And what we're going to do is to look at the second biggest bombing campaign in history during the deadliest conflict in the history of mankind, World War II. And we will look at the effects of strategic bombing of Germany in the Second World War and the extent to which it undermines civilian morale, but also morale in the military. One thing that's probably worth saying at this stage, if you want to interrupt me, any clarifications, questions, there's something that you just didn't understand, please do jump in. There's nothing more irritating than just talking to my screen in my office in Barcelona for an hour and 15 minutes and then somebody's lost somewhere. That's not the point of it. Okay, so this is a historically important question. It's a contemporary question. Bombing is one of the things that happened in Syria and Libya and Serbia, always with an intent to both undermine the effective fighting strength, but also the support for the opposition. Media can play the same role. So there's propaganda for as long as there's conflict and becomes more systematic in the 20th century. And what we're particularly going to look at is the first systematic use of radio, of means of mass communication, not just leafletting and word of mouth, during World War II. Okay, so this is what I just said. This is a big deal. The only time there was more bombing ever was in Vietnam, but Allied bombing in World War II was certainly a huge thing, meaning that on Germany alone, you roughly, the Allies roughly through the equivalent of 100 times the tonnage or the destructive power of the Hiroshima bombs. Okay, so what we're going to do is to come up with a new measure of resistance that we collect from court records, and then we will identify the effects of bombing in two ways. We will use variation in the distance that planes can travel in the early 1940s. And we will also use variation in the weather that induces exogenous changes in the range. And in addition to this data on resistance cases of people engaging in active acts of resistance against the Nazi regime, we'll also look at the performance of German fighter pilots, who are the sort of superstars of the German military. And we will show you how the bombing of their hometowns undermines their will to sort of put maximum effort. And then we'll combine this data on bombing with data on BBC radio reception and exploit some information from a unique 1945 post-war survey to show you how much the radio undermined the will to resist or the will to fight on, and how it interacted with the effects of bombing. Okay, so there's a lot of theorizing and thinking about what this new technology in the form of aerial bombardment might actually do to how wars will be conducted in the future, long before World War II breaks out. So in the early 1920s, an Italian military theorist by the name of Giulio Douhet already wrote a book in Italian called Command of the Air. And he had this vision how the most important thing was to avoid this sort of horrible stalemate in the trenches. And he thought that bombing could do the trick. And then if bombing was sufficiently horrible, he felt that the people themselves, driven by the instinct of self-preservation, would rise up and demand an end to the war. So I think the thing that's very much in his mind, but also in the minds of the Germans as they deal with this threat, is what happens in Germany in 1918, right? So Germany in 1918 is suffering serious military reverses, but then at the same time, a revolution breaks out at home, and that together with the news from the front actually undermines the government's ability and willingness to carry on fighting. And in the 1920s, in the 1930s, there's an entire school of thought that thinks that this is going to be the crucial thing that happens in the next military conflict. So Stanley Baldwin, when he's British Prime Minister, for example, says, no power on earth can protect populations from being bombed. The bomber will always get through. The only defense is an offense, which means to kill more women and children more quickly than the enemy. So this is what people anticipate before the war. There's also devastating bombing of Hamburg, for example, in July 1943. And the German Minister for Armament, a man by the name of Albert Speer, who was actually trained as an architect, at the time said 6 more Hamburgs and Germany will be finished. Okay, so that was the case in favor, but there's also a very strong case against. Lots of historians have written on this. And the overwhelming sense that they have, the conclusion that they come up with, both in terms of the German onslaught on London in 1940-41, but also of the Allied bombing of Germany, is that this didn't work. And if anything, it backfired. So John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, was actually in charge of the committee drafting the final report for a big survey done by the Americans called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. They assessed the industrial impact, the military impact, but they also looked at the morale impact. And the summary conclusion of all of this, in Galbraith's view, is that bombing was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest miscalculation of the war. And Richard Overy, who has written about this as much as anyone, concluded that the effect of bombing was not, as the Allies hoped, to drive a wedge between people and regime, but the opposite. So as you put pressure, people rally around the flag. It's basically fundamentally misguided to think that by putting outside pressure, you can actually undermine people's willingness to fight. And that's what we want to sort of think about, question, and eventually overturn with our empirical evidence. So we're not going to sit here and try to tell you that the history of the Second World War has been miswritten and you need to now realize that there was this important uprising in Berlin that toppled the Hitler regime and he was killed by partisans as Mussolini was. We know that didn't happen. But the idea that the basic mechanism is unsound, that it cannot work, is misguided. So we're going to show you that this works exactly as advertised, but in a police state like Germany, it didn't map into a discontinuity in support for the regime in the same way as it could have done elsewhere. So that's where we want to go. We want to think about how do people react to outside pressure. Please.
What's the counterfactual to a strategic bombing? What would be the right counterfactual to think about?
So some people say that the Allies shouldn't have bombed the Germans at all and just put all their efforts into, closing the mid-Atlantic air gap and make sure the U-boats get hunted and that the supplies get through and, build more tanks and invade the continent earlier that you could have done, for example.
And would these be fiscally equivalent, or would strategic bombing be more expensive in terms of resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wanted to talk about that in a minute, but let me just show you the facts here. So bombing is hugely costly. So this is not a sort of sideshow. So just so that you get the orders of magnitude, because it's kind of mind-boggling. The whole air war for every participant, except the Soviet Union, is the biggest a thing that they spend resources on. So the Germans in 1944 use half of their manufacturing capacity for airframes and air defense. Strategic bombing alone, which is a small subpart of all the things that go into the air war, for the UK consumes 12% of GDP. Okay, so the UK at a peak spends...
So can I ask a question here about what you mean by strategic bombing? Because
oh, yes. Excellent.
That's not very clear. I mean, on the one hand, you seem to be suggesting it means killing civilians.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it could just as well be destroying physical infrastructure. So and presumably it was both.
It's both. So this is actually very interesting. The Americans in particular, but also the British at the beginning, think what they should do is just carefully target some armament factories, bomb them to smithereens, and the German war machine will come to a screeching halt. And for the US, it's particularly close to their military doctrine. So they have this thing that they consider a super weapon called the Norton bomb sight. And they tested in the American Southwest, flying at low altitudes, slowly. And if you've been to the American Southwest, you know that there's never a cloud in the sky. And under these conditions, they have extreme accuracy in their bombing, and they think they can just take out, you know, they actually talk to economists, they find out exactly the input-output matrix, what's the most fragile point, and then, you know, they say ball bearings. If we take out ball bearings, no German tank will be produced, and we can basically just walk into Berlin. And none of this works. Well, surprise, surprise, Europe has lots of clouds. It's mostly, terrible weather conditions for 9 months of the year. Shockingly, the Germans are not happy to be bombed, so they actually shoot back. So you need to fly high. You also need to fly fast because there's planes after you. So the combined effect that they can't hit anything. Even late in the war, it's considered a success if the bombs land within half a kilometer of the target. So effectively, both the British and the Americans switched to aerial bombardment, which is, in the German propaganda language, terror bombing. They just attack cities because that's the one thing they can reliably hit. And for the British, it's really part of their philosophy. They think that this is going to end the war. The commander-in-chief of Bomber Command, the British strategic bombing arm, Arthur Harris, thinks that if they only keep up the pressure a little bit longer in 1944, the Germans are going to collapse, and it becomes a police operation where you just need to go and mop up, and the entire invasion of the continent will be unnecessary, which of course turned out to be wrong. But he was fuming that any of his air crews were sent to support.
So if I understand, so if I understand you, then the point was that it was just not feasible to bomb the infrastructure.
No, they
didn't have the capability to destroy the airports, the railway lines.
Yeah, so that's true for most of the war. So they destroy a lot of stuff, including factories, but most of these factories are back churning out stuff within a month. So despite bombing peaking in 1944, that's when German military production peaks too. And the British actually do something. They do their own bombing study. In some ways, it's a much smaller affair than the American one, but it's better identified. And they find basically in sort of very sensible diff and diff settings that the overall effect on military production is very small. Changes a little bit in 44 when they go for oil, but you should think of the main effect of bombing as destroying civilian housing and killing German civilians. About 400,000 of them die.
But presumably this is a joint output from the point of view of the bombers, which is that you're not good enough to be able to hit a railway line or a railway station or an airport or a bridge. But you are good enough to hit a city, and in a city you'll destroy the city's infrastructure and you will kill people.
You will kill it.
The issue is it's a joint product, right? You're destroying the infrastructure.
That's right. We will, one of the things that they try to accomplish is the undermining of the morale. They try to accomplish other things, and that's where we're going to need our instrumentation strategy. Right? We can't just hit bombing.
But why is the intent irrelevant? I mean, the question is,
well,
supposing it was the case that they intended to destroy the infrastructure is packed together most densely in cities, so that, and you can hit a city even if you can't hit a railway station. Therefore, bomb the cities, you will destroy the infrastructure, and killing people, civilians, is a side effect. So
Yeah, if it worked like that, we wouldn't have a problem with it, but we think it's interesting because it's part of the thing they're trying to maximize. So you know, it's worth saying, I think, that at least for the British, this is one of the aims of the exercise. But you're perfectly right. Even if they had just intended to do damage to infrastructure, you could have had civilian casualties. Ironically, actually, a lot of the manufacturing doesn't take place in the city centers. It takes place in the outskirts. So the best way to actually attack those would have minimized civilian casualties, and that's definitely not what they do.
Okay. Could you give a sense of what was the circular error probability? How accurate were the planes, common planes like B-17, B-29, and so on?
Yeah, so it changes over the war, and it changes by the type of bombing, right? So whether you have visual identification or not. So the beginning of the war, it's really literally a complete joke. So they do this thing called estimated time of arrival bombing. So for about 6 to 9 months per year, there's continuous cloud cover over all of Germany. And you'd have a last fix, say you fly over Amsterdam, and then the navigator would basically tell you that you have to fly, you know, on a course of, you know, 70 degrees north or something. And then they would look at the clock and say, given the estimated airspeed, we should be over Cologne now, and then bomb. And for 1940, 1941, large parts of 42, the Germans were completely puzzled why the British would spend resources on bombing cow sheds in the middle of nowhere and forests and stuff. And the reason is that they couldn't hit anything. It gets better towards the end of the war because they bring in things like radar bombing. They also have these directional beams that radio guide you to your target. That's a little bit better, but not much. So without visuals, they basically have a expected error of several kilometers. And then with visual identification, half the bombs landing within 500 meters of the target is considered a huge success. And that happens so extremely rarely, only under best conditions. Okay, so the error rate is huge. Okay, so it's not just costly for the Germans, it's very costly for the Allies. The British and Americans lose more people in aircrew killed than in ground combat in Europe, for example. So anybody who's read Catch-22 will remember, you know, the survival rate of bomber crews is incredibly low. 70% of them either get taken prisoner or die. Only 27% complete their tour of duty. Okay, we're going to show you that bombing increases resistance. It also reduces the fighting performance of German aces, and we will have some evidence that suggests that it's really effort that's going down. And the BBC radio coverage magnifies these effects. So it's not that they're substitutes, but they're actually complements, and where you have a lot of radio coverage, good radio reception, and probably more listening, and you have bombing, the effect is synergistic, and you get much more resistance overall. Okay, so what's the contribution to the literature? There's a recent well-known paper by Dell and Querubin in Vietnam, and there they basically show that in villages in South Vietnam that are bombed by the Americans, support for the insurgency, for the Viet Cong, actually goes up. And that could be interpreted as saying it's sort of the opposite finding. You bomb people, just makes them unhappy, angry, there's backlash. We don't think that that's what it means. We think it means the opposite. What it means is that, you know, it's a very different setting. It's an internal war. The ally of your government bombs you. And in both cases, your government fails to protect you from, provide sort of physical safety. And when it does that, it loses legitimacy. So we think it's a very related underlying mechanism. It's just that it pans out differently because internal wars with outside military intervention are so weird. And we're looking at something that's much more standard. Then there's big literature on civil and international conflict. For example, there's a recent paper by Tabellini and co-authors where they also look at radio transmission in World War II. But in Italy, where the study is focused, this is used to basically coordinate between the Allies and the Italian partisans. So it's a very different ballgame. There's no attempt to undermine morale and lead to public lack of support. There's big literature on the effects of radio that we're contributing to. And what we do, I think the important thing here is that you have this synergy between actual evidence and radio. I don't want to call it propaganda because the BBC specializes in honest news. Okay, so the Germans distort the truth in all sorts of ways. The British at some point decide that the best strategy is honesty. So they report their own defeats before the Germans even claim victory, for example. Okay, we also think that this is interesting in the context of public support for autocracy. So if you're an autocracy, why do you care what people say? Well, because they don't last forever sometimes. So they use information, misinformation, propaganda in interesting ways. The majority of elections nowadays is actually held in non-democracies, and that shows, it's an opportunity for the government to show how much support there is. So what we do here is to basically look at the role of military damage and foreign propaganda in reducing support for an autocracy at war. So let me tell you about the data. I already talked about this. This is what the final result looks like. This is Cologne in 1945. Every single bridge is blown. And there's not a single house with a roof intact. Miraculously, the cathedral is still standing. Okay, so Cologne is bombed 20 times during the war. And all major German cities will have looked like this by 1945. We have data on daily tonnage per city dropped. Okay, this comes from the operational data of the Allied Air Forces in World War II, and it's all compiled by Davis, and we just put it in a database. This is the second data contribution that we make. There's data from the Volksgerichtshof. This is the People's Court, and it's carefully staffed by Nazi judges, and it has exclusive jurisdiction over high treason cases from 1943 onwards, which is the reason why we start then. So this data on resistance, we read in detail the 640 court cases for high treason involving 2,000 defendants in these 2 years. And for each case, we have data on when the resistance begins, when the Gestapo intervenes and starts to make arrests, when people are charged, when they're tried, and when they're convicted, in most cases, executed. Okay, so what is high treason? Well, in our data, it spans a very wide range. So if you are on the government's blacklist because you were a communist before 1933 and you make the wrong types of jokes in a public place, that can be considered high treason already. If you run around saying Germany's going to lose the war, it's definitely high treason. But that's the sort of extremely low end of the distribution. We also have cases like this one. We have to anonymize the names because of human subject research restrictions. But take the case of Otto W., a counselor at police headquarters in Berlin, and then he's drafted into the military. He writes a letter he never sends to Hitler asking him to stop the war. He also writes to military men and important public figures saying, you know, we need to save Germany, we have to enter in peace negotiations with the Western allies, we should overthrow Hitler and the regime. He tries to talk to high-ranking military officials to sort of stage a coup, and one of them rats him out, and then he tries to flee to Switzerland, but is arrested and sentenced to death in early 1944. So the plotters around Colonel Stauffenberg in the summer of 1944, they're part of our data too. Okay, so there's at least 3 attempts on the life of Hitler that are part of our data set. So it's between sort of popular uprising stuff and high-level military men leading civil servants, threat of coup kind of activity. All of this is high treason. All of this is in our data.
But these things are also probably strategic, right? From the side of Germany, there may be latent, tendencies for resistance, but these cases are basically out there to, in some sense, make people afraid that they should not be, giving these calls for resistance, right? So in that sense, these data, I mean, there's this idea that these trials themselves are in some sense strategic from the side of the Germans.
So they certainly make them into short trials, right? So they actually film the trials against Stauffenberg. They publicly humiliate the defendants and so forth. So they certainly have a propaganda element to them. There's a lot of sort of suspicion, I guess, of what the German secret police does and the courts do, and you know, might they be reacting to the bombing? It's a perfectly reasonable question, no? So that's where it's very important what we actually do. So imagine that a resistance group gets started, a town gets bombed in February, they start in February or March, getting together, trying to sort of talk to POWs working in armaments factories to sabotage armament production, whatever, okay? And then by May, the Gestapo hears of this, they start to infiltrate, collect information. By July, they have enough and they start arresting people. Then in our data for February, we will call this the start of resistance, or March, or whatever it is, okay? And the arrest in the summer will just be later, and that may come from, you know, all sorts of optimizing behavior by the Nazi state. But it's not what we measure. What we measure is this first sort of step into resistance, and because the court records are very rich, they give us all this information in almost all cases. Okay.
I guess my question was that from the Gestapo side, or from the side of the Germans, it may have been very costly to go after every resistance, in which case they would strategically go after some which would be recorded in the data. And that's where, so I'm just concerned about that. That's all.
That's a perfectly reasonable question. We're pretty sure that there is almost no resistance activity that doesn't get detected sooner or later. So the Gestapo is extremely effective. There's something for which they are willing to turn a blind eye. So if you have a completely fine record, you know, you're the frontline soldier on leave in Berlin and you make one disparaging comment that's overheard by a Gestapo spy, they will let you off the hook. But apart from that, anything that's sort of even modest and modestly medium-sized in scale, they sooner or later get them. We're pretty sure we have the universe of resistance activity.
Thanks.
Okay, good. So that's the data on resistance. This is the example. We also have data on pilots. So pilots are interesting and they're kind of a useful thing to look at. I have a related paper where we also use this data because they basically fight on their own, right? So these are only fighter pilots. So there's a single-engined planes with only one pilot. And in every form of aerial combat, every day they have to decide, do I try to sort of do my best to shoot down the enemy plane, which also means that I might die, or do I just sort of go and hide in the cloud, make a token effort, claim that the oxygen wasn't working, and return to base? Okay, and that's easy to do, and it's easy to not provide effort because the modal pilot never shoots down an enemy plane. It's an extremely uneven distribution. So the highest scoring ace in all of human history is a German pilot by the name of Erich Hartmann with 350 confirmed kills, but the modal pilot never scores anything. So in any one day, you can just do what you want, basically. There's no control, there's no way to punish you for slacking off. So without motivation, these guys wouldn't be doing what they do. So the good thing is we can measure output, the number of enemy planes destroyed per day or per month. Rate goes down and the number of planes that you destroy goes down. It's pretty clear that you're just doing less than you could otherwise would. Okay. Town of pilots and say, what does it do to your motivation if your hometown gets bombed? Okay. So we have data on 5,200 pilots' victory claims, but we only look at a subset of 350 high-performing pilots because there we have this extra biographical data from where they come from. So it's 6-7% of all pilots, but they account for half of all victories. Okay. We have data on the BBC German service, so they broadcast in German. On the right-hand side, you actually see one of the leaflets dropped over Germany. announcing a radio broadcast by Thomas Mann, who is a Nobel Prize winning novelist living in exile. And Germany is a country of radio listeners at the time. The Nazis make a big push to get a radio into every household. As you can see here, this is the people's receiver, so the low-end, low-cost model that they actually manufacture at a subsidized, distributed at a subsidized price. The BBC specializes in news that's honest as possible. They also have things that are meant to draw people in. So, for example, POWs get a moment to sort of share their perspective. So if you have any family member who's been taken prisoner, you might listen to him or at least learn something about conditions. It's unclear how many people listen. We cannot know for sure. The Gestapo estimates about 1 million of people doing it. The BBC thinks it might be 10 million. We're not quite sure what it is. They encourage people to engage in acts of subversion, to not do their part on the front, if soldiers are listening and so forth. Oh, I should have mentioned this, that a key selling point for all Allied radio stations is that they play jazz, which the Germans, for ideological reasons, have banned. So the music's just much better. And it's one of the reasons why young people, for example, listen to the BBC. So what do? We take the standard thing now in this literature. There's this irregular terrain model, which gives you the strength of radio reception in Germany, because we know the location of the transmitter in England. We know its strength. And then as a result of differences in both distance and, say, mountains and forests and so forth, we can tell, or we can guess, how strong the radio signal is going to be in any one location in Germany. And with that, we're trying to explain the pattern of resistance. Okay, so an additional source that we use, I mentioned the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. This big statistical effort after 1945 to get a sense of what bombing did to the Germans, the German military, the German industry, as well as civilian morale. So the Americans actually conduct one of the sort of really large scale surveys in the social sciences with 3,700 respondents. And this is what the questionnaires look like. We're the first people to actually digitize them. And you know, we have an awful lot of detail on people and their background and whether they are Nazi party members. And here you have somebody who's a housewife and has 4 children, and then they get asked all sorts of questions about what they think about the occupation, but they also asked about, for example, did you listen to Allied radio? And when did you think the war was lost? And how biased do you think German radio was? And it's pretty sophisticated. So you think that, you know, if you have a GI with a clipboard walking through the ruins of Cologne in the summer of 1945, what's the chance he's going to get an honest answer? So the people who designed this survey are actually from the New School in New York, and it's pretty well done. So they worry about things like social desirability bias. So they ask people questions to sort of trap the ones who are just trying to pander to the interviewer and, you know, maybe get some American chocolate or cigarettes in return, by asking questions like, is George Gershwin the greatest composer who ever lived? And the assumption being that any German who said yes to this question must be lying through his teeth and not revealing his true colors. Okay, so we digitize this stuff, and the main benefit we have from this is that we can validate that this prediction that we have about signal strength and the way it maps into radio listenership is actually correct. We can also validate our data on bombing. So one thing that they get asked is, how many air raids did you experience and how much damage was there in your neighborhood? So we partition our sample based on this official bombing data into places below and above median bombing, and then check this against the 3,700 USSBS returns. What we find is that in those places that got bombed more in our data, people also experienced more air raids, and there's more damage in those neighborhoods, which is just the sort of first pass smell test as we think of it. Okay, so let me tell you about how we're going to identify the effects of bombing and what they are. So what we want to show is, resistance goes up, and morale is depressed if people are being bombed. And it's not clear what the sign is, depending on how you interpret the Dell and Querubin results, for example. So here's the sort of simplest thing you can do. You just aggregate for every German town or city how much they're bombed, and then you look at the number of resistance cases per capita. Pure cross-section, no time variation, no identification, nothing. You just bin scatter it. This is what you get. You get a pretty clearly upward sloping line. There's a relationship, or so the cross-section says, and there's a million reasons not to believe it. They bomb towns for all sorts of reasons. Military role might be changing. They might be deliberately trying to target towns that they know are more likely to resist, maybe because they know that there's more communists agitating there for an end to the war, or more POWs, whatever. So we can't just use bombing as such. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to use for identification is range restrictions. So the workhorse plane for the Allies is the B-17, the Flying Fortress. It's an old plane by this stage. It's a 1935 design. And the official history tells us that in Europe, it had a practical radius of 600 to 700 miles. So we actually look through the mission reports, and we'll have the declassified information from the manufacturer about the effective range. And what we're going to do is to then cross this with what we know about conditions, combat conditions in Europe. So here the manufacturer gives you different ranges, for example, for different conditions: basic, with maximum bombs, with high speed, with high altitude. Ferry range means that it doesn't carry anything other than itself. So no bombs, no armament, no extra crew. And unsurprisingly, that affects the total range that the plane has. So if you're just trying to fly it empty, basically you can get to 2,600 miles. That's a lot. And then if you fly high and fast, it's 595. So what we end up with is an estimate of the maximum feasible range of 985 kilometers. And that's partly just because of this range restriction here that comes just from the mechanics. As I said, the US Air Force was unpleasantly surprised that the Germans shot back. So they need to fly faster and higher than they thought they would, and have to start much earlier than they thought they would. They thought that only over the target do they need to climb. They need to be high the entire way from the Dutch coast to Berlin. The second thing that's hugely complicated is that they need to form up. So for most of the war, these planes fly without escort. So the way to protect themselves is what they call combat boxes, which is to stack the planes in particular patterns. And this is, for example, the way it's meant to look. This is from declassified tactical training manuals of the 8th Air Force. You can see in the upper left corner, for example, how different groups are meant to fly in formation. And then in the lower left, you see the view from the front. So this is how they're meant to stack up. All of this is designed so that they can protect themselves as much as possible. Now, getting planes into this position is a complicated thing. This is how it's meant to look at the end. So the 3 different squadrons you just saw here, of course, they then have to fly with other squadrons. And the whole thing is hugely complicated. To give you a sense of it, many of these raids are so big, involving 1,000 planes or so, that when the first plane is over Berlin, the last one has just crossed the German border. So many of these formations are hundreds of kilometers long. So to get them into this position costs time, and it cuts range because it uses up fuel. So, they need to fly over England in these circles to form up into these different formations. Here you have a color for each one of these groups that you just saw. And this is what it looks like over England. This is the entire area of East Anglia. To make sure that they don't bump into each other, everybody gets the area in which they can slowly assemble, and then they start going to Berlin, okay? So this is what it gives us. The black circle line is the 985 range. In the upper left corner, everything in red is bombing, and the bigger the dot, the more bombing there is. In the lower right, every red dot is a bombed city, and every black dot is a city that's not bombed. Okay, so you can see that this is going to work more or less, but it's not entirely perfect. So you want to say, you know, what about those red dots down here? Why is there any bombing beyond actual range? Well, because it's only one plane that they have. The British have other planes that have some other weaknesses, but they have slightly longer range, so they can, for example, use these. The B-17s can also fly further. It's just that they have to reduce the load. So you can make them fly further, but then you carry very few bombs, and then you can bomb just a little bit outside your normal standard operational range. So what we're going to use is, in one of our specifications, a sort of fuzzy RDD. Okay, so here's a heat map of bombing for Germany, and you can see, you know, there's very heavy bombing far to the west, close to England. It gets less already as you move further east, and then beyond the black line, there's almost nothing. And this is the resistance heat map. Okay, so you know, it's not exactly the same distribution, but if you look at the right and the left of the black line, you can see how little resistance there is. Now, those of you well versed in German history may rightly ask, isn't the entire East agricultural and devoid of any sort of industrial workers who might actually resist the regime, etc.? And that is true for some areas of East Germany, but it's not true for all of them, especially this area down here. Let me just highlight this. This area down here, this is Silesia, and this is heavily industrial. This is centered on the city of Breslau, and this is, you know, as industrial as, say, Leipzig or something. And there's no resistance activity there. Okay, so just sort of from doing ocular econometrics, you get a sense that this might work. Of course, we try to do better. So we do sharp RDD estimation, where we just look at the change in tonnage along a 200-kilometer interval around the maximum range line. That gives us a sharp reduction in bombing intensity. It also sharply changes the number of resistance cases, and then you can do this fuzzy RDD where you use bombing as a running variable. Okay, so if you just plot the RDDs in a super simple way, to the left means within the bombing circle, to the right means outside of it. You can see the step down as you hit the capacity, the distance constraint of the main plane at the time. Okay.
I have a couple of clarificatory questions.
Please.
Why do you specifically focus on B-17, as in what proportion of bombing? I know B-17 was one of the most popular planes, but what proportion of bombing did it contribute to? And is the bombing data basically only for B-17, or is it for all?
No. We use everything. We use everything as the bombing variable. We explain it with B-17 range for two reasons. One is that the U.S. Air Forces actually deliver the majority of bombing. So it's, and the U.S. has, for example, the B-24 in Europe. It's a medium bomber with also a lot of capacity, but very little protection. They can't fly it all the way into Germany and back, and they never do. They use it in France, for example. They use it in Italy all the time, but you don't use it strategically over Germany. The British, of course, don't use the B-17. They actually don't like it. They actually have their own planes, and they have slightly longer range, especially the Avro Lancaster can fly a little bit further. So, you know, you could just use bombing by B-17s, but, you know, if the instrument is valid, it will still shift the total bombing. You can do it any way you like, you always get the same thing. It's about 2/3 of total bombing that's delivered by B-17s. I think, you know, the imperfection shows you that it's, you know, it's not a perfect way to get things right. We only use it for the RDD. We have a second identification strategy that I'll tell you in a minute, which then applies to all planes on all missions.
Okay, I have another question. Is the choice of B-17 motivated by some strategic considerations, as in Germans using some kind of anti-aircraft guns at certain places, and maybe B-17 provides more protection compared to those, and that's why basically that will determine the maximum range, right?
Yeah, no. So that's a good question. So in principle, the B-17 should be able to fly much further, but they soon realized that there's much more anti-aircraft activity over Germany than they anticipate. There's also much more attacks by fighters. So the Americans have this one attempt when they try to put precision bombing into practice, when they attacked Schweinfurt in 1943 with the ball bearing factories. And this is a sort of, beautiful spring day kind of scenario. The bombing when it hits is fairly accurate, but they lose something like a third of the attacking force. So the casualties are unsustainably high, and then afterwards they say, well, we can't do this anymore.
So
the answer is exactly right. The B-17 is the only plane that they can up armor to a point where there's some chance of the crew to survive. Repeating myself, but 70% of them don't survive. But at least on a single mission, you have an attrition rate of say 3-4%. That's why they overwhelmingly use it. And one of the reasons why it flies so much less than the design specification is that they have to put all this armor in. They also put many more men in. They put many more machine guns in for the plane to defend itself. And once they're done with all of this, it can't fly very far.
So my point is that this threshold might be driven by strategic considerations of the Germans, because the German choice to put their anti-aircraft guns at, let's say, Berlin, which was close to this threshold, if they put their anti-aircraft guns elsewhere, then the choice of plane would have been different. It would have used less armor, and then the bombing might have looked completely different.
No, I think you're sort of half right. I don't think, I haven't thought about it enough, I think, but I think it's not a problem for us, because the Germans pretty much try to defend the entire airspace, and they start already in Holland and the outlying islands, and they have anti-aircraft protection ships along the coastline and so forth. So just to make sure that as soon as there's planes overhead, somebody shoots at them. So the entire path is basically studded with anti-aircraft positions. So it's not that they just, put them in some places and then those places get attacked, and that then limits the range. All of German territory is like a very spiny hedgehog. And because the Allies know this is the plane they use, this is the type of mission they fly, high and fast, and so forth. And that then means that the range is very limited, as a result of the Germans trying to do what they can to reduce the impact and incidence of this. Okay, so this is our RDD evidence. Let me tell you about the panel results. So what are we going to do?
Before you go on, can I just ask you a question about the RDD? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. So why are you... it's a linear specification, right? So everything is hinging on the fact on that, or do you have a local polynomial as well?
We have all sorts of specifications. You can do different thresholds. You can exclude certain locations, estimate donuts. You can have...
No. I mean with regard to the running variable.
Oh, when we do the fuzzy RDD, you mean? Yeah, so,
well, your diagram seems to suggest that you're using...
Yeah, no, this is just an illustration. So, we can do the standard RDD thing with higher order polynomials. You can put in the...
You don't want to use higher order polynomials. You want to use local polynomials, because higher order polynomials will be affected by the points at the end of the range.
That's right, yes. So
it's a well-known thing, right?
I know. We do everything that's in the book on the dark arts of RDD. And it always pretty much gives you the same thing. Maybe the best way to illustrate it would be to use the standard Dell specification, the meter paper, which we do perform. We just don't make it the main specification, but maybe that would make more sense.
Yeah, so I think you should, if you do show a graph, you should show us the local polynomial.
Okay.
That's much more convincing, right? Because I can draw a straight line through these points, which wouldn't break either on the left, for example.
Well, I think you'll agree that there's more inside the circle than outside. The question is there discontinuity at the line? And yes,
exactly.
For that.
But that depends very heavily on the specification for the running variable.
Yep, that's right. Oh, that's right. So, you know, maybe it was too simple.
That's the fundamental weakness of RDDs.
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that. And I was just looking for something simple to illustrate the basic pattern, not taking this as the final empirical specification that you want to put all your trust in. But I hear you. Maybe it's a better way to just show the strength of the RDD. Okay, so let me tell you about the panel results. What we want to do is explain resistance in town or city I in month M as a function of how much it gets bombed and how good the radio reception is. So the good thing about the panel is that we can use city fixed effects. We can also use month fixed effects. So a lot of stuff that you might worry about gets differenced out. Now, we don't want to do that just in the naive specifications for all the reasons we have already discussed. So what we're going to use is variation in the weather that shifts the incidence of bombing. So what are we going to use? We're going to use the wind. Why? First, the most natural reaction is to think, why would wind make any difference, right? If you have a tailwind on the way in, then you have a headwind on the way out. So why isn't it a wash? Why is this not just a zero-sum thing? Well, think about the following thought experiment. Think of a plane that flies at 300 miles an hour. And in the beginning, you have a tailwind. So you actually, your time to target is 300 miles an hour as well. So time to target is half. You get there twice as fast as you otherwise would. And then you turn around and you want to go back home. How long does it take you to go back home? And the answer is forever, right? You're going to be stationary above the ground because the headwind is as fast as you can fly. So because of this, and because the wind is not perpendicular to how the planes fly, wind tends to be coming from the Atlantic, so from the west towards the east, you always get this somewhat surprising but interesting effect that stronger wind means that the maximum range is cut. Okay, and this is what the operation manuals actually say. A strong wind at this altitude further reduce the effective radius of operations. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use this quadratic specification, interacting wind with distance to London, and predict bombing with that. And we're going to do that at the daily level. So we have wind speeds from all over Germany. We have these weather stations that report 3 times a day, things like cloud cover, whether it rains, and wind speeds. And we're going to explain daily bombing with that, and then aggregate up to the monthly level in a sort of split sample design. Okay, so here's the daily data, 684,000 observations. And what you can see is that the interaction of distance to London squared and average wind speed is negative. And it's negative and significant only for the same day and 1 day later, but for all other days, there's no significant effect. So what this means is that on an average day with a strong wind, the targets furthest away get bombed less, but the targets close by actually get bombed more. So they just use their capacity to hit the targets they can reach, but the ones that are beyond range because of the wind, they get hit less. Okay, so why do you get what looks like a false positive same day and 1 day later? Because the targeting tends to be done 1 day before. So the normal pattern for the US at least is that they decide the targets the evening before, and then the next morning you tell the crews where they're going to go. They assemble at 5 or 6 in the morning, and then they fly to make it back before nightfall. Okay, so we think of this as useful in the sense that there's definitely nothing going on 1 day before, 2 days before, 3 days before. So now we're going to aggregate this to the monthly level and look at resistance cases with predicted bombing. We do the standard thing of running bootstraps to make sure that the estimated regressant doesn't create the wrong type of standard errors here. As you can see, this has a lot of predictive power for new resistance cases, the start of new resistance. So now that we're in the panel, now that we're using time series variation, we can actually exploit this fact that we have information on when people start to resist. And that's the part that's explained by bombing, or the part of bombing that's driven by weather variation. Just to make sure that this is not sort of reflecting the dynamics of repression, of secrets, police activity, and so forth, we throw in the number of arrests, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the coefficient, doesn't explain new resistance cases. So it's really orthogonal. And you can see how, you know, whether you do the intensive margin, number of cases, extensive margin, any resistance at all, you always get something, meaning it has explanatory power. Okay. So the cumulative effect of this, for example, of bombing is that if you hadn't bombed, you would have had 70% less resistance, which means roughly 3 fewer plots to assassinate Hitler. Okay, so here we do the same thing to show that we don't get false positives. So it's in the same month that these new resistance cases overwhelmingly start. We have a little bit of a positive coefficient that I think is not a problem, 1 month later or 2 months later. Okay, so these are positive, they're not significant, but they're both not zero either in magnitude. So, you know, it's not a problem for us if people start a month later. They shouldn't start earlier. 2 months earlier, the sign is negative, 1 month earlier, the coefficient is small and insignificant. So we sort of think that there's reasonable validation in sort of Angrist Pischke spirit that this is not a problem, that there's nothing going on in terms of false positives. Okay, so let me show you the evidence on pilot performance. So here we're now going to take confirmed victories. So there's a big bureaucracy in Berlin that actually processes claims. You need to submit victory claims with a lot of paperwork. You need a witness, you need to say what happened to the enemy plane, where it was shot down, give a grid reference, a map reference, and everything. So, and then many of these claims are not accepted. So, of course, the best thing is if you actually have gun camera footage. So many planes actually have this, so they actually run a camera film through every time they touch the fire control. And then you have the image of the enemy plane blowing up. That makes it very easy. But you know, for one pilot, for example, a guy called Heinz Nocke, he has 33 confirmed enemy planes shot down, but 15 other claims that weren't confirmed. Okay, so they take this fairly seriously, and we are fairly confident that these are reasonable numbers. Okay, so we're going to explain this with personal fixed effects. As I said, it's a big thing. Most pilots never perform. A handful of them score all the time. So we're going to take out this personal fixed effect. It's going to explain a lot as it is. And then we have variables for the front on which you fly. The east was easier than the west. For the squadron in which you fly, the type of equipment that you have, the experience you have. But we also add in a very naive thing where we just say, you know, this is a month in which your hometown gets bombed. And when it gets bombed for the first time, we make it an absorbing state. So if your town goes from unbombed, never bombed, to bombed at least once, we just change it from 0 to 1. And you can do it in different ways to sort of ask yourself, is there declining marginal returns to this? Does it get worse with more repetitions? And the effect, if anything, gets bigger. Okay, so just before somebody worries about this, let me show you this. It's natural to say maybe somebody, you know, performs less after the hometown gets bombed because that's where they live and work, and that's where the airfield is, and maybe that's affected. So every triangle here is a birthplace of a pilot in our data set. That's actually someone who comes from Russia, it's a German-Russian, returns to the Reich. And every black dot is a airfield from which they fly. And you can see that the overwhelming majority of the pilots just are operating on airfields that are very, very far away from Germany. So what does it show? This is the number of enemy planes shot down per month in a number of specifications. So the coefficient certainly doesn't get smaller as you add controls. Well, it jumps and then it goes down a little bit. So in a sort of autonomy sense, we're fairly confident we're finding something meaningful here. So how big is this effect? Well, in an average month, these pilots destroyed 2 enemy planes. So that goes down by a quarter, by half a plane or so in most specifications. So it's a huge change. It's a big change. And if you actually look at the cumulative effect, I'll have a graph in a minute, it's certainly substantial. So back of an envelope, there's about 1,000 fewer planes shot down as a result of hometown bombing. Okay, so skip this. Here we look at, is the first time the worst time, or is it, you know, higher order bombings? First time has an effect. 6 to 15th goes up, or more than 15 times, goes up even more. Okay. Now all of this is econometrically, shall we say, challenging because you're putting a lot of trust in basically the effect of a dummy. And the control group is really not obvious because you're basically, with all S, you're making everybody else the control group. So one thing that we did here is use synthetic control methods. So for every person whose town gets bombed, you basically pick 1 or 2 pilots who perform on average prior to treatment like the pilot whose hometown is going to be hit. And then once they hit, you actually see whether they diverge or they stay the same. So the monthly treatment effect is what you see on the left. And on the right, you have the cumulative effect from synthetic control methods. So what this suggests is a very substantial and relatively rapid effect that keeps growing in size, maxes out at around 20, 30 months after the event. You know, why it recovers in the end, you can debate, right? So the number of pilots who fly for 40 months after their hometown gets bombed is very, very small because that's almost the duration of the war. Okay, so we think this is important because so much depends on the motivation of a handful of sort of top performing guys. Why they start to slack off suddenly is a good question. We can show you that it's to do with effort provision. So this is the rate at which they die. Okay, so these are exponentiated coefficients from a Cox regression. So 1 here would mean that the risk of exit, which in almost all cases means death or being wounded or taken POW, would be constant. So the smallest effect is that it declines, the risk of exit declines by a quarter, and it can decline by more than 40% depending on the specification that you want to believe in. Okay, so there's a very large change in risk taking simultaneously with a decline in the number of planes shot down, and we think that this indicates that this is just a sharp reduction in the provision of effort. Okay, yeah, let me show you one more thing about Berlin while we zoom in on Berlin. Well, first of all, Berlin is, of course, the capital of Germany. It's super important. The nice thing is that we have variation within Berlin. So here you see in the middle, the guy with the glasses, that's Baumann Harris. And he's looking at a giant folio called the Blue Book. And why is it called blue? Well, not because of how it makes the Germans feel, though that's true too, but they color in every city block that's destroyed in blue. And this is the image, the final image for Berlin. It's cumulative, they don't do it monthly. So we only have one cross section, you know, this is for March 1945, before the Russians get to Berlin. And here we have at the city block level, the extent of damage. And what do we do with that? Well, we basically have assigned this to 1,000 grid cells in the city of Berlin, and then measure resistance within Berlin in these different parts of town. And what you see here is just a very naive bin scatter. So again, here we have no time series variation because the British didn't keep monthly level blue books. That's one cumulative thing. So what you see is that within the city of Berlin, where you can hold a lot of things constant, like, you know, say the efficiency of the local Gestapo office, in those parts of town where there's more bombing, more people decide to resist. Okay. All right. So, you know, this is just saying the thing with statistics that I just said verbally. Let me tell you a little bit, or show you a little bit about the effects, the interaction effects between bombing and radio. So the first thing is that you need to be sure that you're identifying who listens to the radio. And the nice thing is that we actually have from this United States Strategic Bombing Survey these reports about listening from people. Right? They get asked whether they listen to Allied stations. And then our terrain model gives us a predicted signal strength. And what we do here is just plot these things against each other, and it has this standard S-curve that radio listening typically has in these settings. Okay, so stronger signal means more people listen, and then below a certain threshold, the reception gets so bad that you can't really hear anything. It's like a Skype call, you know, you just give up and people check out. Okay, so that's what we're going to use. So this is just validating that the listening we get from the survey actually correlates with our measure of radio availability, and the cross-section does. And then we interact, we first use it just to explain resistance cases in the pure cross-section. You know, it works, but it's kind of feeble, so it doesn't have a huge bang for the buck, and it depends a little bit on the specification, whether it's significant at all. It never becomes very significant. So radio alone doesn't seem to be doing a great deal, but then if you actually interact it with the bombing in the panel, with a part of the bombing coming from weather variation, we actually find pretty big effects. So when I say big effects, what do I mean? It means that bombing could have been 25% less if you increase the strength of the radio signal by a quarter. Okay. So that we think is a big thing. It would have saved 100,000 German lives, it would have saved 20,000 Allied airmen's lives, and you could have had the same level of resistance in Germany, which of course is not the only thing they were trying to accomplish, but it was one of the things they were trying to accomplish. So there's a lot of evidence for this synergy in our data. So let me try to think about for a second about why that is. What's the mechanism that we have in mind? And we think that the reason why it works is it's like a validation exercise. So you hear things, and you know, as a good Bayesian, you don't really know what's true. Maybe the Germans are telling you the truth, maybe the British are telling you the truth. Resistance means that you form some view on whether Germany is winning or losing. If Germany is going to conquer the world, why would you risk your life to oppose it? If it's certain that the US Army is going to enter your village tomorrow, you're probably also not going to resist because there's no benefit from doing so. The regime's also done in. So it's in that intermediate zone where it's unclear, but possible that the Germans might lose, that you are more likely to resist, where you think that there's some benefit to Germany standing in the world, or doing this honorific thing to usher in a new regime. That's where people might actually take action. So how does bombing and radio interact to create that effect? Well, we think that, you know, you listen to the radio, you don't know what's true. You listen to the Germans, you don't know if that's true either. But as the British tell you that they're winning, for a long time they told you that they were losing, but now they're telling you that they're winning, and you actually see the evidence of how strong the Allies are, you will start to update that belief about whether Germany has a chance to win or not. And the confirmation on your doorstep of the British saying, today 1,000 bombers hit Cologne, major devastation, you know, fires seen all the way to the Dutch coast. If you're close to Cologne and you hear that and you see it, that's probably more likely to help you update your priors about who's going to win this war than if you never see it firsthand and you just hear the propaganda. And without the framing and all the information about what's going on and how badly the Germans are doing, maybe the bombing on its own also doesn't do a great deal. So what the estimates suggest is that bombing is effective, it just becomes a lot more effective. Radio alone hardly doesn't do anything at all. So that's what we think is the mechanism behind this. For the pilots, it's probably a little bit different. So of course, we don't know what's exactly in their heads, but one of the things that probably motivates them is social standing. So being a fighter pilot, especially during the early stage of the war, is the equivalent of being a soccer player for Barca these days. There's playing cards with your image on it. You're on the front page of the German equivalent of Life magazine. You know, all the women come and ask you for autographs if you're in the street and stuff. So these people have extremely high social standing in the beginning. And then slowly, as the war turns against Germany and German cities fall apart, everybody turns against the Air Force and everybody's making jokes and so forth. And some of them are very bad. So these people basically lose whatever pride they had in their job and instead become scapegoats, not their fault, individually. The war is turning against them, but they feel that the Air Force is letting people down, not protecting Germany. And now, you know, why would you be the last casualty in a losing war? So what have we shown you? Contrary to the standard historical accounts, bombing works in inverted commas, meaning the mechanism, the idea that you just, if you put outside pressure, you create backlash, you create resistance, that doesn't seem to be true. In the aggregate, in one of these major cases in history, where we can actually investigate with quantitative data, the opposite seems to be true. There's a strong effect that suggests that military pressure actually creates declining support for an autocratic regime. And then there's a synergy between bombing and the media. There's also an effect on military morale, which could sharply reduce the fighting effectiveness of any army or air force. So that's what we think we have and what it means. And I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Joachim, can I ask a question, please?
Please.
Yeah, very nice work. Just two issues. One is, do you know the effectiveness of Gestapo in those places? Meaning, how, if there is another related question is about persistency of resistance, or if there is any demonstration effect?
So we don't really have a good measure of how effective the Gestapo is.
Okay.
Overall, all the historical narrative suggests it's extremely effective. So Germany, in contrast to, so here's the proof. Here's the proof. The best thing for you in post-45 Germany would have been to be able to claim that you're a resistance fighter.
Right.
Many people wanted to claim that. Right, so that's what happens in France. As soon as the Germans are gone, everybody claims that they were in the resistance.
Okay.
So, of course, the German military records suggest that being stationed in France was like being on vacation. So that tells you just how bad the experience was, as in not at all. There's hardly any people in Germany who successfully claim that they were part of the resistance in any form, shape, or size. The people who did resist died.
Okay. Okay, that's good. That's good. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
How do you isolate the effect of bombing with radio? It could simply have been the case that as the messaging, so the effect on morale and resistance could purely be that the messaging of BBC radio changes, and that's what leads to the kind of effects you see. So, like, do you have some suppose there was no bombing, but there could have been just a pure change in messaging of BBC, and they just say that we are winning for whatever reason, for propaganda reasons and whatnot. So how do you...
So we actually have data, right? We estimate what's the effect of signal strength without bombing. So basically the RDD gives you this, because the RDD line is so far in the east that there's no radio reception. These guys can't listen to the BBC, but you still get the stepwise function in terms of resistance as in line with the bombing intensity. So it is true that the further west you are, the better the reception is, and the more bombing you're going to get. So here we have to hope that our identification strategy with wind speed, weather patterns actually works.
Or as you say, the messaging could have been synchronized with the bombing, right?
Yeah, but that's not what they do. So the message is news, it's a lot of entertainment, good music, and it's sort of some information about POWs, but they're not tuning the message to, you know, the location of a raid, for example. As far as I know. I mean, the transcripts don't survive. It would be lovely to be able to exploit those and get a sense of which kind of message works best and so forth, but there's no surviving tapes or transcripts of what they actually broadcast. We have information, we have some schedules, we know what's on them, we know from famous people like Thomas Mann what they said, but we don't really know from day to day how much it changes. The program is always the same, meaning the structure of the program is the same. It doesn't change from one day to the next, and I very much doubt that they would have varied the content for, you know, now talking about Cologne because Cologne is getting bombed.
Okay, that makes sense. My question was that if purely the messaging changes, then what without the bombing?
Okay.
We have about, I think, 5 minutes for questions, so keep them coming. I just kind of want to jump in here and just ask sort of something to clarify sort of the end conclusion. So my understanding is that bombing by itself seems to have pretty large effects, but if it interacts with these radio messages, it has a bigger effect, but radio by itself can't do much.
Yeah, that's right. That's what it seems to suggest.
So there's all this. I mean, I'm not particularly familiar. I just sort of vaguely know of this. You know, these studies on the impact of radio and propaganda. There's no bombing, I think, in whatever I've read, you know, it's in various.
Yeah, I mean, you know, David Yanigazawa in his work on Rwanda, for example, finds very strong effects that this really sort of incited people to start killing their neighbors. My co-authors in their paper on Nazi radio in 1933 find what I think are relatively limited effects. So, you know, it adds a couple of percentage points to a Nazi vote, but it doesn't really move the needle to such a great extent. So I think you know, we have other media studies that suggest sizable or bigger effects than that. I think there's a strong sense that radio can make a difference, but it's not clear how much it can influence very costly activities. So apart from David Yanigazawa's work on Rwanda, most of these are sort of low effort things at the margin. Voting in a voting booth is not costly, but doing something that might get me killed, that's pretty costly. Yep. So that's what we measure here.
Yep. That makes sense. So I guess can just any other questions at this point?
Can I ask a question about persistence? I think that Prasad asked, you know, I was wondering why the effects dissipate right after a month. I mean, is it like a knee-jerk reaction? You see this bombing and you feel like, you know, that you're losing and...
yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I think, you know, this is just the bane of econometric analysis. So normally I hate time series variation. I think like any good applied economist, time series variation is an incredibly hard thing to exploit and make effective for this kind of thing. So we have the standard thing that it's like a running joke for macroeconomists, right? Long and variable lags. I'm sure that some people will see bombing but only get going later. But you don't know how long that delay is. And filtering that out and finding it in the data, I think, is probably close to mission impossible. So we do the best we can. Yeah, I wouldn't claim based on our evidence that we're sure that it's really only in the same month. That's what jumps out in a well-identified way. I think that's fair to say. But I wouldn't be surprised that I'm sure you could torture the data with VARs and so forth in such a way as to suggest that there's responses at a later stage.
Okay.
Joachim, I have a question about the wind as the instrument. So are there times when you'd expect the winds to be higher and strategically change your your target area in some sense? Because there are times of the year when you expect the winds to be particularly strong in particular areas, right? So here there is some sort of notion of unpredictability or exogenous variation in the whether it's a strong wind or not. But is that very? Is that always true?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? What are the sort of wind patterns over Europe? So winds in the fall are stronger than in the spring and summer. That's for sure. We try to take care of that with month fixed effects. And I think that should be successful. So what's driving the variation here? That's your question, right? What's doing things at the margin? So it's not just that we have weather variation for a day. Okay, so it's not an average daily thing, but it's the wind speed over your location. Okay, which at the beginning of the war, the British didn't really know very well, or the Americans, and then it gets better as the war goes on. So by 1944, they actually have weather scouting planes that don't do anything but fly over Germany. Look at cloud conditions, super important for bombing, but also wind speeds and so forth. So then they get real-time information. And sometimes when the plane's already in the air, they change target. So you may think that you can hit Frankfurt on their order, and then they realize that the winds are just too strong, and instead they hit Frankfurt on mine, which is about 350 miles closer.
And so the identifying assumption is that has nothing to do with resistance as
exactly. Such. That is not driven by you trying to now help or encourage resistance in Frankfurt. That's the assumption that you have to make, and as long as you believe that, then our results are well identified.
I see. Thank you.
All right.
So I think we're out of time.
Thank you for your questions.
So I want to thank our speaker. I want to thank the participants for keep this pretty lively talk. So I guess we're going to move to some